There are spots in Charleston, South Carolina, where the ground itself appears to remember, where the soil holds secrets that not even rain can wash away, and where certain truths lie buried under layers of clay and time. In the spring of 1847, surveyors for the city began recording something that defied every natural law they knew. Across 7 different plantations throughout the Low Country, from the Ashley River to the Cooper, from the Sea Islands to the inland swamps, they found slave quarters that shared an impossible trait. No rats made nests in their walls. No snakes slid beneath their floors. No insects crept through the cracks in their foundations. The buildings stood empty of vermin, as if nature itself had drawn a line no creature would cross. The surveyors noted this oddity in their official reports, but those documents were quietly filed away, stamped with a seal reading, "Administrative review pending," and never saw public light. What the city officials discovered in those quarters was considered too disturbing, too politically volatile for the fragile peace of the antebellum South. But truth has a way of resurfacing, even from deep burial. And the story of what truly happened in those buildings, what connected them all, what kept the animals away, and what it cost the people forced to live inside those walls, reveals something far more chilling than any supernatural tale ever could. Before we continue with the story of Charleston's silent quarters and the surveyor who refused to let truth stay buried, I need you to do something. If you're fascinated by real historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and unsettling truth, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel digs into the darkest corners of American history, the stories that were deliberately forgotten, the truths that powerful people wanted erased. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments. Let's see how far these forgotten stories can reach. Now, let's return to Charleston, 1847, and meet the man who would spend 3 years of his life unraveling a mystery that would haunt him to his final breath. Charleston, in 1847, was a city of contradictions, a place where immense wealth existed alongside profound suffering, where grand mansions with their piazzas and gardens stood within sight of the auction blocks where human beings were bought and sold. The city had grown prosperous on rice, indigo, and cotton. That prosperity had created an aristocracy that prided itself on refinement, education, and what they called civilization. The streets were paved with ballast stones brought from distant ports. Gas lamps illuminated the main thoroughfares. The bells of St. Michael's Church rang out over a city that considered itself the jewel of the South. But beneath this veneer of gentility lay a system of brutal exploitation. The low country plantations surrounding Charleston were among the most profitable in the nation and also among the deadliest. The rice fields with their standing water and malarial mosquitoes killed enslaved workers at rates that shocked even hardened overseers. The task system used in the region was considered more humane than the gang labor of the cotton plantations further inland. But it was still a system built on the theft of human freedom, on families torn apart, on lives measured only by their economic value. Into this world came Elias Vance, a surveyor and civil engineer from Philadelphia. He was 32 years old in the spring of 1847, a man of medium height with dark hair already graying at the temples and eyes that colleagues described as unsettlingly observant. Vance had studied at the University of Pennsylvania under some of the finest scientific minds of his generation. He had learned not just the practical skills of surveying, the use of theodolites and chains, the calculation of angles and distances, but also geology, chemistry, and what was then called natural philosophy. He approached the world with a scientist's skepticism and a reformer's conscience. Vance had come to Charleston reluctantly. His firm in Philadelphia had secured a contract with the city to conduct a comprehensive survey of properties in the surrounding low country. The work was meant to establish clear boundaries for tax purposes, to settle disputes between neighboring plantations, and to create accurate maps for a region settled piecemeal over more than a century. It was routine work, the kind that paid well but offered little intellectual stimulation. Vance had accepted the assignment primarily because he needed the money. His father had died the previous year, leaving debts that Elias felt honor-bound to settle. He arrived in Charleston on a humid April morning when the city was fragrant with the scent of Confederate jasmine and the harbor was crowded with ships from around the world. He took lodgings in a boarding house on Church Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Talbert, who was known for maintaining a respectable establishment and asking few questions of her tenants. The room was small but clean, with a window overlooking a garden where camellias bloomed in profusion. Vance's first weeks in Charleston were spent in the city offices reviewing existing property records and maps. The documents were a mess, some dating back to original colonial land grants, others hastily drawn during property transfers, many contradicting each other significantly. He quickly realized the survey would take far longer than his firm had estimated. But he was a methodical man, and he set about organizing the chaos with the same careful attention he brought to all his work. It was during this preliminary research that he first encountered mention of the silent quarters. The reference appeared in a report filed by a city health inspector named Thomas Gadsden in 1843. Gadsden had been investigating an outbreak of fever on several plantations and had noted almost as an aside that certain slave quarters seemed remarkably free of the usual vermin and pestilence. He had attributed this to superior construction or perhaps the particular composition of the soil but had not investigated further. The comment was buried in a lengthy report filled with statistics about mortality rates and recommendations for drainage improvements. Vance might have overlooked it entirely except that he found two more references in subsequent years. Another inspector had noted the same phenomenon at a different plantation. Then a surveyor's report from 1846 mentioned that the slave quarters at the Middleton plantation had no evidence of rat infestation, unlike every other structure on the property. Each time the observation was treated as a curiosity, nothing more. But Vance's scientific training had taught him to pay attention to patterns, to anomalies that repeated themselves. And there was something about these reports that troubled him. In his experience, slave quarters were invariably infested with vermin. The structures were poorly built with gaps in the walls and floors that provided easy access for rats and snakes. The inhabitants had few resources to fight infestations. Food scraps and waste attracted pests. It was one of the many cruelties of the system that people were forced to live in conditions that would have been considered intolerable for livestock. So how could multiple quarters across different plantations be free of vermin? What could possibly explain such a consistent anomaly? Vance decided to investigate. It would mean deviating from his assigned work, spending time on something that had no bearing on property boundaries or tax assessments, but his curiosity was aroused, and he had never been good at ignoring questions that demanded answers. He began by requesting permission to visit the plantations mentioned in the reports. This proved more difficult than he had anticipated. Plantation owners in the Charleston Low Country were suspicious of outsiders, particularly Northerners, especially those who asked too many questions about the living conditions of enslaved people. The political tensions between North and South were already running high in 1847. The Mexican-American War was underway, and the question of whether new territories would permit slavery was inflaming passions on both sides. Abolition was a word that could end a conversation or start a fight. But Vance had his official credentials as a surveyor, and he framed his requests in terms of his assigned work. He needed to survey property boundaries, he explained, and that required walking the entire extent of each plantation, including the areas where the quarters were located. Most owners granted permission, though often with conditions. He was to be accompanied by an overseer. He was not to speak with the enslaved people. He was to conduct his work quickly and leave. The first plantation he visited was called Riverside, located about 15 miles up the Ashley River from Charleston. It was a rice plantation, one of the most profitable in the region, owned by a man named Nathaniel Drayton. The main house was a magnificent structure of brick and stucco surrounded by live oaks draped with Spanish moss. The rice fields stretched for hundreds of acres, divided by a complex system of dikes and canals that allowed the fields to be flooded and drained according to the needs of the crop. The slave quarters at Riverside were located about a quarter-mile from the main house, a row of small wooden structures that housed nearly 200 people. Vance was accompanied by the plantation's head overseer, a man named Cyrus Holt, who made no effort to hide his contempt for the surveyor's interest in the Negro houses. "They're just shacks," Holt said as they walked toward the quarters. Built cheap, fall apart every few years, we put up new ones. Nothing special about them. But as they approached, Vance noticed something that made him slow his pace. The quarters were indeed crude structures, single-room buildings with palmetto-thatched roofs and walls made of rough-hewn boards, but they were silent in a way that seemed unnatural. There were no sounds of scurrying in the walls, no rustle of movement beneath the floors, and more striking still, there were no snakes sunning themselves on the wooden steps, no rat droppings visible in the dirt around the foundations. Vance asked permission to enter one of the quarters. Holt shrugged and opened the door to a building that was currently unoccupied, its inhabitants in the fields. The interior was dim and spare, a few rough pallets on the floor, a small fireplace, some cooking implements. The air smelled of smoke and sweat and the particular mustiness of old wood, but there was no evidence of vermin. No holes gnawed in the walls, no nests in the corners, no snakeskins shed in the rafters. "You see," Holt said, "nothing here. Can we get on with the real work?" But Vance was examining the walls, running his hands over the rough boards. And then he noticed something. The gaps between the boards had been filled with a gray clay packed in tightly to seal the cracks. This was not unusual in itself. Many structures used clay chinking to keep out drafts and rain. But this clay had a particular texture, almost greasy to the touch, and a faint smell he couldn't quite identify. Something mineral, something that reminded him of the smell of a blacksmith's forge. "Where did this clay come from?" he asked. Holt looked at him as if he'd asked the color of the sky. "From the ground, I expect. There's clay all over this property. The Negroes dig it up and use it for chinking, for making bricks, for whatever they need. But from where specifically? Which part of the property?" Holt's expression shifted from contempt to irritation. "How the hell should I know? You'd have to ask them, and I'm not about to waste my time translating questions about dirt." Vance made a note in his surveying book. Then he asked if he could take a sample of the clay. Holt shrugged again. What possible interest could a surveyor have in clay? And Vance carefully scraped some of the material into a small glass vial he carried for soil samples. Over the next 3 weeks, Vance visited 6 more plantations where the reports had mentioned quarters free of vermin. Each time he found the same thing, structures that were silent and empty of pests, and walls that had been chinked with a particular gray clay. The clay was always the same, that greasy texture, that faint metallic smell, and each time he asked about its source, he received vague answers. It came from somewhere on the property. The enslaved people knew where to find it. The overseers and owners had never paid attention to such details. But Vance was beginning to form a hypothesis. The clay was keeping the vermin away. Something in its composition, some mineral content, some chemical property was acting as a natural repellent. It was an interesting discovery from a scientific standpoint, but it raised troubling questions. If the clay repelled rats and snakes, what effect might it have on the people living in constant proximity to it? Were there health consequences that no one had considered? He decided he needed to analyze the clay properly, using the chemical techniques he had learned at university. But Charleston had limited scientific facilities, and he didn't trust the local authorities with his findings. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. So he wrote to a colleague in Philadelphia, a chemist named Dr. Alistair Finch, and sent him samples of the clay along with a detailed description of where it had been found and under what circumstances. Then he waited. Mail between Charleston and Philadelphia took at least a week in each direction, and he knew that a proper chemical analysis would take time. In the meanwhile, he continued his official surveying work, but his mind kept returning to the silent quarters and the strange gray clay. It was during this waiting period that Vance first spoke with someone who had actually lived in one of the quarters. Her name was Era, though she was known to everyone as ma'am, a term of respect that acknowledged her age and the authority she held within the enslaved community. She was perhaps 60 years old, though she looked older, her face deeply lined and her hair completely white. She had been born into slavery on one of the Sea Island plantations and had spent her entire life in the Low Country. She was currently living at a plantation called Oakwood, where Vance had come to survey a disputed property line. He encountered her by chance, or perhaps by her design. He had been working alone that day, the overseer had been called away to deal with some emergency in the fields, and he was taking measurements near the quarters when Era approached him. She moved slowly, leaning on a walking stick, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. "You the men been asking about the quiet houses," she said. It was not a question. Vance was startled. He had been careful to frame his inquiries in neutral terms, to avoid drawing attention to his real interest. But apparently word had spread through the network of communication that existed among the enslaved people, invisible to their owners, but remarkably efficient. "I'm a surveyor," he said carefully. "I've noticed that some of the quarters seem to be free of vermin, and I'm curious about why." Era studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "You got the look of a man who wants to know things. But knowing things can be dangerous, especially for a white man asking questions about how we live." "I mean no harm," Vance said. "I'm simply trying to understand." "Understand what?" "Why the rats don't come. Why the snakes stay away." She shook her head slowly. "Those houses are quiet because of the mud. The gray mud from the bad place. We've been using it for years because it keeps the vermin out. And Lord knows we got enough troubles without rats eating our food and snakes biting our children." "The bad place?" Vance asked. "What do you mean?" Era glanced around, checking that they were truly alone. Then she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "There's a swamp about 3 miles inland from here. The old people call it the Whispering Earth. The mud there is different. Gray and heavy. And it smells like metal. Animals won't go near it. Birds don't fly over it. Even the mosquitoes stay away. We learned a long time ago that if you pack that mud into the walls of a house, the vermin won't come in. So we use it. We walk 3 miles to dig it up. We carry it back in buckets. We pack it into every crack and gap. Because a house without rats is a blessing, even if," she trailed off, and Vance saw something in her expression that chilled him. Fear and something else. Resignation, perhaps. The look of someone who knows a terrible truth but has no power to change it. "Even if what?" he prompted gently. Era was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Even if the people who live in those houses get sick. Even if they get weak and tired, if their bones ache, if their teeth fall out, if they waste away for no reason the doctors can name. We know the mud is bad for us. We've known it for years. But we use it anyway because the choice is between slow sickness and rats that spread fever, snakes that kill children, insects that make life unbearable. We choose the slow sickness. We don't have the luxury of choosing health." Vance felt something twist in his chest. "How long have people been using this mud?" "Long as I can remember," Era said. "My grandmother used it. Her mother before her. It's been going on since the first quarters were built on these plantations, maybe longer. The white folks never noticed, never cared. Why would they? They don't live in those houses. They don't breathe that dust every day. They don't watch their children grow up weak and sick." "Where exactly is this swamp?" Vance asked. "The Whispering Earth." Era gave him directions, a complex set of landmarks involving old trees, abandoned rice fields, and paths that weren't marked on any map. Then she said, "You going to go there?" "Yes," Vance said. "I need to see it for myself. I need to understand what's in that mud." "And then what?" Era asked. "Say you figure it out. Say you learn that the mud is poison, that it's been killing us slow for generations. What are you going to do with that knowledge? You think the masters will care? You think they'll tear down the quarters and build new ones with clean materials? Or will they just find a new way to save money, a new way to make us suffer. Vance had no answer to that. He wanted to believe that knowledge would lead to change, that exposing the truth would force people to act. But he was not naive. He knew the power structures of the South, knew how little value was placed on the lives of enslaved people. "I don't know what will happen," he said finally. "But I have to try. I have to document what I find. Maybe it won't change anything now. But someday, when this system finally ends, and it will end, it must end, maybe this information will matter. Maybe it will be part of the accounting, part of the record of what was done to your people." Era looked at him with an expression that might have been pity. "You're a good man, I think. But good men don't change the world. Power changes the world. And you don't have any power here." She turned and walked away, leaning heavily on her stick, leaving Vance standing alone with his surveying equipment and his growing sense of dread. The Whispering Earth was not marked on any map Vance had seen. Following Era's directions, he set out early one morning in late May, when the heat was already oppressive and the air thick with humidity. He told Mrs. Talbert that he would be gone for the day conducting field surveys, and he packed water, some bread and cheese, his surveying tools, and several glass vials for collecting samples. The journey took him inland, away from the plantations and into the wild low country that existed between the cultivated fields. This was a landscape of dense maritime forest, palmetto thickets, and swamps where the water was the color of tea from the tannins leached out of decaying vegetation. The paths were narrow and often flooded, and Vance found himself wading through water that came up to his knees, his boots squelching in the mud. He had been walking for nearly 2 hours when he noticed the change. The forest around him had grown quieter. The constant background noise of birds and insects had faded to near silence. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air still and heavy. And there was a smell, faint at first but growing stronger as he continued, that same metallic odor he had noticed in the clay samples, but more intense, almost overwhelming. Then he saw it, the swamp that Era had called the Whispering Earth. It was perhaps 2 acres in extent, a depression in the landscape where water had pooled and stagnated. But the water was not the dark tea color of normal swamp water. It was gray, almost milky, with an oily sheen on its surface. The trees around the edges were dead or dying, their bark peeling away to reveal pale wood beneath. And the ground at the water's edge was covered with the gray clay, exposed where the water level had dropped during the dry season. Vance approached slowly, every instinct telling him this was a place of danger. He could see no animals, no birds in the trees, no turtles sunning on logs, no fish breaking the surface of the water. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the squelch of his boots in the mud. He knelt at the edge of the swamp and examined the clay. It was exactly like the samples he had collected from the quarters, that same greasy texture, that same metallic smell. He filled several vials with the material, being careful not to let it touch his skin more than necessary. Then he took out a small notebook and began to sketch the area, noting the dead trees, the color of the water, the absence of life. As he worked, he became aware of a sound. It was very faint, almost at the edge of hearing, a kind of whisper or hiss that seemed to come from the swamp itself. He realized it was the sound of gas bubbles rising through the water and bursting at the surface, releasing whatever compounds were trapped in the sediment below. It was a natural phenomenon, but in the eerie silence of the place, it sounded almost like voices, like the earth itself was speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The Whispering Earth. Now he understood the name. He spent perhaps an hour at the swamp collecting samples and making observations. Then, as the sun climbed higher and the heat became unbearable, he began the long walk back to Charleston. His mind was racing with possibilities. What was in that clay? What mineral or chemical gave it those properties? The ability to repel animals, the greasy texture, the metallic smell. And most importantly, what effect did it have on human health? He thought of Era's words, the people who live in those houses get sick. They get weak and tired. Their bones ache. Their teeth fall out. Those were symptoms of something, some kind of poisoning or deficiency. But what? When he returned to his boarding house that evening, exhausted and covered in mud, he found a letter waiting for him. It was from Dr. Alastair Finch in Philadelphia, responding to the clay samples Vance had sent weeks earlier. Vance tore open the envelope with shaking hands and read. My dear Vance, I have completed my analysis of the clay samples you sent, and I must confess that the results are both fascinating and deeply troubling. The material contains extraordinarily high concentrations of several heavy metals, most notably lead, arsenic, and mercury. The lead content alone is sufficient to explain the absence of vermin. Rats and snakes are highly sensitive to lead poisoning and will avoid areas where it is present in the environment. However, I must stress that these same properties make the clay extremely dangerous to human health. Chronic exposure to lead causes a constellation of symptoms including fatigue, weakness, abdominal pain, cognitive impairment, and in severe cases, death. Arsenic and mercury have similar effects. If people are living in structures where this clay has been used extensively, they are essentially being poisoned slowly over the course of years or decades. The source of these metals is likely geological. There must be some mineral deposit in the area where the clay is found that is leaching these compounds into the soil and water. Such deposits are not uncommon in coastal regions, but they are usually avoided for habitation precisely because of their toxic properties. I urge you to bring this matter to the attention of the relevant authorities immediately. If what you describe is accurate, that this clay has been used in the construction of housing for enslaved people across multiple plantations, then we are looking at a public health crisis of significant proportions. Please write to me with any further developments. I remain your colleague and friend, Dr. Alastair Finch. Vance read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. He had suspected the clay was harmful, but the reality was worse than he had imagined. Lead, arsenic, mercury, these were poisons, pure and simple. And people had been living with them, breathing the dust, touching the walls, for generations. He thought of the children growing up in those quarters, their developing brains and bodies exposed to neurotoxins from their first breath. He thought of the women and men who had no choice but to live in those structures, who had chosen the slow death of poisoning over the immediate threat of vermin. He thought of Era's words, "We don't have the luxury of choosing health." And he knew that he had to do something. He had to document this. Had to bring it to light. Had to force someone to acknowledge what was happening. But who would listen? Who would care? The next morning, Vance went to the Charleston city offices with Dr. Finch's letter and his own detailed notes. He requested a meeting with the city health officer, a man named Dr. Samuel Priolo, who was responsible for monitoring disease outbreaks and sanitary conditions in the city and surrounding areas. Dr. Priolo was a Charleston native, a man in his 50s with the refined manners and accent of the local aristocracy. He received Vance in his office, a room lined with medical texts and anatomical charts, and listened politely as the surveyor explained his findings. When Vance finished, Dr. Priolo was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Vance, I appreciate your diligence in bringing this matter to my attention. However, I must point out several issues with your conclusions." "Issues?" Vance said, struggling to keep his voice level. "Dr. Finch's analysis is quite clear. The clay contains dangerous levels of heavy metals. People are being poisoned." "Dr. Finch is a respected chemist, I'm sure," Priolo said smoothly. "But he is analyzing samples in a laboratory in Philadelphia, far removed from the actual conditions here. He does not understand the constitution of the Negro, which is fundamentally different from that of the white man. What might be harmful to us may have little effect on them. They are adapted to this climate, to these conditions, in ways that we are not." Vance stared at him in disbelief. "That's not how chemistry works. Lead is lead. It doesn't discriminate based on race." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Priolo said, his tone becoming cooler. "There is extensive medical literature on the differences between the races. The Negro has a thicker skin, a different blood composition, a greater tolerance for heat and disease. These are established scientific facts. They're not facts, Vance said, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. They're justifications, excuses for treating people as less than human. Priolo's expression hardened. Mr. Vance, I understand that you come from Philadelphia, where certain progressive ideas are fashionable. But you are in Charleston now, and you would do well to remember that the institution of slavery is the foundation of our economy and our society. It is protected by law and by custom, and I will not allow unfounded accusations about the health conditions of slave quarters to be used as ammunition by abolitionists and troublemakers. These aren't unfounded accusations, Vance said. I have chemical analysis. I have samples. I have testimony from people who have lived in these quarters and watched their families sicken and die. Testimony from slaves, Priolo said, his voice dripping with contempt. Slaves who would say anything to cause trouble for their masters. That's your evidence. Vance realized he was getting nowhere. Priolo had no interest in the truth. He was part of the system, benefiting from it, and he would defend it against any challenge, no matter how well documented. I see, Vance said quietly. Thank you for your time, Dr. Priolo. He left the office feeling a mixture of rage and despair. He had been naive to think that presenting the facts would be enough. The people in power didn't want to know the truth. They wanted to maintain the status quo, to protect their wealth and their way of life, no matter the human cost. But Vance was not ready to give up. If the local authorities wouldn't act, perhaps he could find other avenues. He wrote to abolitionist newspapers in the North detailing his findings. He wrote to medical journals hoping that Dr. Finch's analysis would be published and discussed. He wrote to members of Congress who were known to oppose slavery, providing them with documentation that could be used in debates. And he continued his investigation. If he was going to expose this crime, and he had come to think of it as a crime, a deliberate poisoning of innocent people, then he needed more than just chemical analysis. He needed to document the human cost, to show the world what this poisoning looked like in real terms. He began visiting plantations again, but this time he sought out the enslaved people themselves, speaking to them when overseers weren't watching, asking about their health, their families, their experiences living in the quarters. It was dangerous work. If he was caught, he could be run off the plantations or worse. But he was driven by a sense of moral urgency that overrode his caution. What he learned was heartbreaking. Story after story of children who had died young, of adults who had lost their strength and vitality in their 30s, of mysterious ailments that doctors couldn't explain or treat. He heard about the chronic pain that many people suffered, the weakness in their limbs, the confusion and memory loss that came over them. He heard about miscarriages and stillbirths, about children born with deformities or developmental delays. And in every case, the pattern was the same. The symptoms were worst in people who had lived their entire lives in quarters chinked with the gray clay. Those who had been moved to different quarters or who had spent time away from the plantations often showed some improvement. It was a clear dose-response relationship, exactly what you would expect from chronic poisoning. Vance documented everything meticulously. He created charts showing the correlation between time spent in the contaminated quarters and the severity of symptoms. He collected testimonies, though he had to be careful about how he recorded them. He couldn't use real names, couldn't identify specific plantations, because that would put his informants at risk of retaliation. As the summer of 1847 turned to fall, Vance became increasingly consumed by his investigation. He neglected his official surveying work, spending his days tracking down leads and his nights writing up his findings. Mrs. Talbert began to worry about him. He was losing weight, sleeping poorly, becoming withdrawn and obsessive. And he was being watched. He didn't realize it at first, but the plantation owners had taken note of his activities, a northern surveyor who spent too much time talking to slaves, who asked too many questions about their living conditions, who seemed to have an agenda beyond his official duties. This was suspicious, potentially dangerous. In October, Vance received a visit from a man named Richard Wentworth, who introduced himself as a representative of the Charleston Planters Association. Wentworth was in his 40s, impeccably dressed, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to power. "Mr. Vance," he said, settling into a chair in the boarding house parlor, "I understand you've been conducting some kind of investigation into the slave quarters on various plantations." "I'm a surveyor," Vance said carefully. "I'm conducting the survey I was contracted to do." "Come now," Wentworth said with a thin smile. "Let's not play games. We know you've been asking questions about health conditions, collecting samples of building materials, corresponding with abolitionists in the North. We know you've been speaking with slaves without permission from their owners. These are serious matters, Mr. Vance." "I've discovered a serious public health issue," Vance said. "The clay being used in the construction of slave quarters contains dangerous levels of heavy metals. People are being poisoned." "So I've heard," Wentworth said. "And I'm here to tell you that your investigation is over. You will cease all inquiries into this matter. You will destroy any documents you've created. And you will leave Charleston within the week." "I will do no such thing," Vance said, his voice shaking with anger. "What's happening here is a crime. People are dying because of negligence and greed. People are dying because they are slaves," Wentworth said flatly. "They are property, Mr. Vance. They have no rights, no legal standing. And you, as a visitor to this city, have no authority to interfere in how property is managed." "They're human beings," Vance said. "That is a matter of opinion," Wentworth replied. "And it is not an opinion shared by the laws of South Carolina or the United States. Now, I've been polite, Mr. Vance, because I understand that you're simply misguided, that you've been influenced by the radical ideas that are so fashionable in Philadelphia. But my patience has limits. If you continue with this investigation, if you publish your findings or share them with abolitionist agitators, there will be consequences. Your surveying contract will be terminated. Your reputation will be destroyed. And you may find that Charleston is not a safe place for you." It was a threat, barely veiled. Vance felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to meet Wentworth's eyes. "I'm not afraid of you." "Then you're a fool," Wentworth said. He stood, adjusting his coat. "You have 1 week, Mr. Vance. I suggest you use it wisely." After Wentworth left, Vance sat alone in the parlor, his mind racing. He was in danger. That much was clear. But he couldn't simply abandon his investigation. He couldn't let this crime go unexposed. He thought of Era, of all the people he had spoken with, of the children growing up in those poison quarters. He owed them something. He owed them the truth. But he also had to be realistic. If he stayed in Charleston, he would likely be silenced one way or another. His documents would be seized or destroyed. He might be arrested on some trumped-up charge or simply disappear one night, another victim of the violence that lurked beneath the surface of Southern gentility. He needed to get his findings out of Charleston, to somewhere they would be safe, where they could be published and disseminated. And he needed to do it quickly, before Wentworth's deadline expired. He spent the next 3 days working frantically, making multiple copies of all his documents, his notes, his maps, his chemical analyses, his testimonies. He packed them into several parcels, addressing them to different people: Dr. Finch in Philadelphia, an abolitionist newspaper editor in Boston, a congressman in Washington. He took the parcels to different post offices and shipping companies, spreading them out so that if one was intercepted, the others might still get through. Then, on the 6th day after Wentworth's visit, he left Charleston. He told Mrs. Talbert that he was going to Savannah for a few days to consult with colleagues. He took only a small bag with him, leaving most of his possessions behind, and he boarded a northbound train, watching the city recede into the distance with a mixture of relief and regret. He had failed to change anything in Charleston. The quarters would continue to poison their inhabitants. The plantation owners would continue to profit from their suffering. The authorities would continue to look the other way. but he had documented the truth. And someday, he believed, that truth would matter. Vance returned to Philadelphia in November of 1847, physically and emotionally exhausted. He had lost nearly 20 pounds during his time in Charleston, and he suffered from nightmares that left him gasping awake in the darkness, his sheets soaked with sweat. In his dreams, he walked through endless rows of silent quarters, their walls oozing with gray clay while ghostly figures watched him with accusing eyes. Dr. Finch was shocked by his friend's appearance. "My God, Elias," he said when they met at a coffee house near the university. "What happened to you down there?" Vance told him everything. The investigation, the discoveries, the threats, the flight from Charleston. Finch listened with growing horror. "We have to publish this," Finch said when Vance finished. "We have to get this information out to the public." "I've tried," Vance said wearily. "I sent copies of my findings to newspapers, to medical journals, to politicians. Most haven't responded. Those that have, they're not interested. The northern papers say it's too inflammatory, that it will be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. The medical journals say they need more rigorous scientific evidence. That testimonies from slaves aren't reliable data. The politicians say they can't act without official reports from local authorities. And we both know those authorities will never acknowledge the problem. So what do we do?" Finch asked. "I don't know," Vance admitted. "I feel like I'm shouting into a void. I have the truth. I have the evidence. But no one wants to hear it." But Finch was not ready to give up. He was a member of the American Philosophical Society, one of the oldest and most prestigious scientific organizations in the country. He proposed that Vance present his findings at one of the society's meetings, framing it as a case study in environmental toxicology rather than a political statement about slavery. Vance agreed, though he was skeptical about what it would accomplish. He spent the next several weeks preparing a formal presentation, complete with chemical analyses, maps, and statistical data. He deliberately downplayed the human element, focusing instead on the scientific aspects, the composition of the clay, the mechanism by which heavy metals leach into the environment, the dose-response relationships in chronic poisoning. The presentation took place on a cold evening in January of 1848. The audience consisted of about 30 people, professors, physicians, chemists, and other members of the scientific community. Vance spoke for nearly an hour, his voice steady despite his nervousness, presenting his findings with the same careful precision he had used in his surveying work. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then the questions began. "How can you be certain that the symptoms you describe are caused by the clay and not by other factors?" one physician asked. "Slaves live in conditions of extreme hardship. They suffer from malnutrition, overwork, exposure to disease. Any of these could explain the health problems you observed." "I accounted for those factors," Vance said. "I compared health outcomes between people living in quarters with the contaminated clay and those living in quarters without it, controlling for other variables as much as possible. The correlation is clear and consistent." "But your sample size is small," another scientist objected, "and your data collection methods were informal, shall we say. You relied heavily on anecdotal reports rather than systematic medical examinations." "I worked with the resources I had," Vance said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "I couldn't exactly conduct controlled experiments on human subjects. But the chemical analysis is solid. Dr. Finch can attest to that. The clay contains dangerous levels of lead, arsenic, and mercury. That's not anecdotal. That's measurable, reproducible fact." "No one is disputing the chemical analysis," a third man said. This was Dr. Morton, a prominent physician and anthropologist. "But I think you're making a logical leap that isn't supported by the evidence. You're assuming that what is toxic to white Europeans is equally toxic to Africans. But there is substantial evidence that different races have different physiological responses to environmental factors. The Negro constitution may be more resistant to these metals than our own." Vance felt his temper rising. "That's pseudoscientific nonsense," he said sharply. "Lead poisoning doesn't discriminate by race. The mechanism is the same regardless of skin color." "I'm afraid you're allowing your political sympathies to cloud your scientific judgment," Dr. Morton said coldly. "This presentation has been less about toxicology and more about abolitionist propaganda." The meeting dissolved into argument after that, with some members defending Vance's work and others attacking it. In the end, the society declined to publish his findings in their proceedings, citing insufficient scientific rigor and political bias. Vance left the meeting feeling defeated. Even here, among people who prided themselves on their commitment to reason and evidence, the truth was being rejected because it was inconvenient, because it challenged assumptions about race and slavery that were deeply embedded in American society. But there was one person in the audience who had listened carefully and believed. Her name was Catherine Hartwell, and she was the daughter of a wealthy Philadelphia merchant who had made his fortune in shipping. Catherine was 26 years old, unmarried by choice, and deeply involved in the abolitionist movement. She had attended the presentation because she was interested in anything that might provide ammunition against slavery, and she had been riveted by Vance's testimony. She approached him after the meeting, introducing herself and asking if they could speak privately. They met the next day at her family's townhouse, a grand building on Rittenhouse Square. "Mr. Vance," she said once they were settled in the parlor, "I believe your findings are important, and I want to help you get them published. But I think you've been going about it the wrong way." "What do you mean?" Vance asked. "You've been trying to present this as a purely scientific matter," Catherine said. "But it's not. It's a moral matter, a political matter. The reason people are rejecting your work isn't because the science is flawed. It's because accepting your conclusions would require them to acknowledge that slavery is even more monstrous than they already know it to be. And most people, even those who consider themselves enlightened, aren't ready to do that. So what do you suggest?" Vance asked. "Stop trying to convince scientists and politicians," Catherine said. "Go directly to the public. Tell your story in a way that makes people feel the horror of what you discovered. Make them see the human cost, not just the chemical formulas." "I tried that," Vance said. "The newspapers won't publish it." "The mainstream newspapers won't," Catherine agreed. "But there are abolitionist publications that will. And there are lecture circuits, speaking tours. People will pay to hear first-hand accounts of the evils of slavery. You could reach thousands of people that way." Vance was hesitant. He was not a natural public speaker, and the idea of turning his investigation into a kind of performance made him uncomfortable. But Catherine was persuasive, and he was desperate to do something, anything, to make his work matter. Over the next several months, with Catherine's help and connections, Vance began speaking at abolitionist meetings and churches throughout Pennsylvania and New York. He told the story of the silent quarters, of the gray clay, and the slow poisoning of the people who had no choice but to live in those toxic structures. He showed his maps and his chemical analyses. He read excerpts from the testimonies he had collected, being careful to protect the identities of those who had spoken to him. The response was powerful. Audiences were horrified and outraged. Some people wept openly as Vance described the children growing up in those quarters, their bodies and minds damaged by toxins they couldn't see or understand. Others shouted demands for justice, for action, for an end to the system that allowed such atrocities. But Vance also faced hostility. At several events, pro-slavery agitators disrupted his talks, shouting him down or threatening violence. He received anonymous letters calling him a liar, a traitor, a race mixer. One night, someone threw a brick through the window of his lodgings with a note attached that read, "Go back to Charleston and we'll give you a proper Southern welcome." Despite the dangers, Vance continued his speaking tour throughout 1848 and into 1849. He became a minor celebrity in abolitionist circles, his story cited as evidence of slavery's inherent cruelty. Frederick Douglass mentioned him in a speech. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote him a letter expressing her admiration for his courage. But Vance took no pleasure in the attention. He was haunted by the knowledge that his work had changed nothing for the people still living in those quarters. The plantations continued to operate. The clay continued to poison. And he was hundreds of miles away, telling stories to audiences who could afford to be horrified because they were safely removed from the reality. In the summer of 1849, Vance received a letter that would change everything. It was from a man named Jacob Hemlock, who identified himself as a free black man living in Charleston. Hemlock wrote that he had heard about Vance's work through the abolitionist network, and he had information that Vance needed to know. The letter was cryptic, but it hinted at something significant. New evidence about the source of the contaminated clay, about who knew what and when, about decisions that had been made deliberately rather than through ignorance. Hemlock couldn't put the details in writing, he said, because it was too dangerous. But if Vance would return to Charleston, Hemlock would share everything he knew. Vance showed the letter to Catherine. It could be a trap, she said immediately. You know there are people in Charleston who would love to get their hands on you. I know, Vance said. But what if it's real? What if there's more to this story than I uncovered? I can't ignore it. Then don't go alone, Catherine said. Take someone with you. Someone who can be a witness, who can get word out if something happens to you. In the end, Vance decided to return to Charleston, but he took precautions. He arranged for regular letters to be sent to Catherine and Dr. Finch so that if he disappeared, they would know something was wrong. He traveled under an assumed name, and he carried a pistol, though he had never fired one in his life and doubted he would have the courage to use it if it came to that. He arrived in Charleston in August of 1849, nearly 2 years after he had fled the city. It was the height of summer, and the heat was suffocating, the air so humid that it felt like breathing water. He took a room at a different boarding house in a different part of the city and sent word to Jacob Hemlock through the address provided in the letter. 2 days later, Hemlock came to meet him. He was a man in his 50s, with gray hair and the careful, guarded manner of someone who had learned to navigate a world that was hostile to his existence. Free blacks in Charleston occupied a precarious position. They had some legal rights, but they were constantly under suspicion, subject to restrictions and harassment. They met in Vance's room, with the door locked and the curtains drawn. Hemlock got straight to the point. What you found about the clay is true, he said. But it's worse than you know. It wasn't ignorance, Mr. Vance. It was deliberate. Vance felt his blood run cold. What do you mean? I mean that the plantation owners knew, Hemlock said. They knew the clay was poisonous. They knew it was making people sick. And they used it anyway because it was cheap and because it kept the vermin out and because they didn't care what happened to the people living in those quarters. How do you know this? Vance asked. Because I used to work for one of them, Hemlock said. Before I bought my freedom, I was a house servant for a man named Nathaniel Drayton. You know him? Vance nodded. Riverside Plantation, the first place he had investigated. Drayton kept records, Hemlock continued. Detailed records of everything, crop yields, expenses, slave purchases, medical costs. And in those records there are notes about the quarters. About how using the gray clay from the Whispering Earth reduced the cost of construction and eliminated the need for pest control. About how the slaves who lived in those quarters had higher rates of sickness and death. But that was acceptable because the savings on construction and maintenance more than offset the cost of replacing them. Vance felt sick. He calculated it. He weighed the cost of human lives against the cost of building materials. That's exactly what he did, Hemlock said. And he wasn't the only one. The plantation owners talked about it among themselves. They shared information about where to find the clay, how to use it most effectively. It was a business decision, Mr. Vance. A cold, rational business decision that treated human beings as nothing more than livestock, as assets to be managed for maximum profit. Where are these records? Vance asked. Can you get them? Hemlock shook his head. Drayton keeps them in a safe in his study. I don't have access anymore. But I know they exist, and I know what they say because I saw them when I was still in his household. I was taught to read and write. Drayton's wife insisted on it, said it made me more useful. And sometimes I was asked to help with copying documents. That's how I saw the notes about the quarters. Would you testify to this? Vance asked. Would you be willing to make a sworn statement? Hemlock laughed bitterly. Who would believe the testimony of a black man against a white plantation owner? Even if I could testify, and I'm not sure I legally can, it would be my word against his. And we both know whose word would be given more weight. But if we could get the records themselves, Vance said, his mind racing. If we could get documentary evidence, something that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or bias. You're talking about breaking into Drayton's house, Hemlock said flatly. You're talking about theft. That's a crime, Mr. Vance. A serious crime. You'd be risking prison or worse. I know, Vance said. But those records could prove everything. They could show that this wasn't negligence. It was deliberate poisoning. That could change the whole conversation about slavery. Could provide legal grounds for prosecution. Or it could get you killed, Hemlock said. And me too, for helping you. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Vance said, I'm going to do it. I have to. But I won't ask you to be involved. You've already risked enough by coming here, by telling me this. Hemlock studied him with an expression that was hard to read. Then he said, You're a fool, Mr. Vance. But you're a brave fool. All right. I'll help you. But we do this my way. And we do it carefully. Over the next week, Hemlock and Vance planned their break-in with meticulous care. Hemlock knew the layout of Drayton's house intimately. He had lived and worked there for 15 years before purchasing his freedom. He knew which doors were kept locked, which windows were accessible, where the servants slept, and most importantly, when Drayton would be away from the house. There was a Planters Association meeting scheduled for the third Saturday in August. Drayton would attend, as he always did, and the meeting typically lasted several hours, well into the evening. His wife would be at home, but she retired early and slept in a bedroom on the opposite side of the house from the study. The house servants would be in their quarters behind the main building. It was the best opportunity they were likely to get. Vance spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation. He knew what he was planning was dangerous, possibly suicidal. If he was caught, he would be arrested, tried, and almost certainly convicted. As a northerner who had already made himself unwelcome in Charleston, he could expect no mercy. And Hemlock would face even worse consequences. A black man involved in robbing a white man's house would likely be lynched before he ever saw the inside of a courtroom. But Vance couldn't shake the conviction that this was necessary. The records Hemlock described could be the evidence he needed to prove that the poisoning of the quarters was not an accident, not a result of ignorance, but a deliberate choice made by people who valued profit over human life. That evidence could change the national conversation about slavery, could provide ammunition for abolitionists, could even lead to legal action. On the night of the break-in, Vance met Hemlock at a predetermined location, a small warehouse near the docks used for storing cotton bales. They waited until well after dark, until the streets were mostly empty and the gas lamps cast long shadows. Then they made their way to Drayton's house, moving carefully through the back alleys and gardens of the city. The house was a grand structure on Meeting Street, 3 stories of brick and stucco with a wide piazza facing the street. But Hemlock led Vance around to the back, to a small door that opened into the kitchen. He produced a key. He had kept it when he left Drayton's service, a small act of defiance he had never expected to use. The door opened silently, and they slipped inside. The kitchen was dark and empty, smelling of old smoke and spices. They moved through it quickly, into a hallway, and then to the study. The study was exactly as Hemlock had described, a large room lined with bookshelves, with a massive desk in the center and a safe built into the wall behind it. Vance felt his heart pounding as he approached the safe. This was the moment of truth. If Hemlock was wrong about the records, if they had taken this risk for nothing, but Hemlock was already working on the safe. He had brought tools, a set of lockpicks that he had acquired from sources he didn't explain. He worked by the light of a small lantern, his fingers moving with surprising dexterity. It took nearly 20 minutes, minutes that felt like hours to Vance, who stood watch by the door, listening for any sound of movement in the house. But finally, there was a soft click, and the safe door swung open. Inside were stacks of papers, ledgers, and bound volumes. Hemlock began sorting through them quickly, his eyes scanning the pages by lantern light. Then he pulled out a leather-bound ledger and opened it. "This is it," he whispered. "This is Drayton's personal record book. Look." Vance leaned over his shoulder and read by the flickering light. The entries were written in a neat, precise hand, recording expenses and income, purchases and sales. And there, on a page dated 1839, was an entry that made Vance's blood run cold. Constructed new quarters for field hands using clay from the western swamp. Material costs reduced by 60% compared to standard construction. Note, clay appears to repel vermin effectively, eliminating need for pest control measures. Some reports of increased sickness among inhabitants, but mortality rates remain within acceptable parameters for field labor. Net savings, $1,200 annually. There were more entries over the following years, tracking the experiment with the clay quarters. Drayton had noted the health effects, the weakness, the bone pain, the cognitive decline, but he had framed them purely in economic terms. How much did it cost to replace a worker who died young versus the savings on construction and pest control? The calculations were there, cold and precise, reducing human suffering to a matter of dollars and cents. "My God," Vance whispered. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Keep reading," Hemlock said grimly. Vance turned the pages and found more. Drayton had shared his findings with other plantation owners. There were notes about meetings where the use of the clay was discussed, where the health effects were acknowledged but deemed acceptable given the cost savings. There were even references to a collective decision to keep the information quiet, to avoid agitation from abolitionist elements who might use it as propaganda. It was all there. The evidence Vance had been seeking, proof that the poisoning was deliberate, that it was part of a calculated strategy to maximize profit at the expense of human life. "We need to take this," Vance said. "We need to get this out of here." "We can't take the whole ledger," Hemlock said. "It would be noticed immediately. But we can copy the relevant pages." They had brought paper and pencils for this purpose. Working as quickly as they could, they copied the incriminating entries, Vance writing while Hemlock held the lantern and kept watch. It took nearly an hour, and every minute was agony, the fear of discovery a constant weight on Vance's chest. Finally, they finished. Hemlock returned the ledger to the safe and closed it, making sure everything looked exactly as they had found it. Then they slipped back out of the house, retracing their steps through the kitchen and out into the night. They didn't speak until they were several blocks away, back in the relative safety of the warehouse district. Then Hemlock said, "You have what you need now. Get out of Charleston tonight if you can. Don't wait." "What about you?" Vance asked. "I'll be fine," Hemlock said. "I know how to be invisible in this city. But you're a marked man. If Drayton or any of the others suspect you were involved in this, they'll come after you. And they won't be gentle." Vance nodded. He knew Hemlock was right. He had what he came for, and now he needed to get it to safety, to people who could use it. They parted ways in the darkness, Hemlock disappearing into the maze of alleys with the ease of long practice, Vance heading back to his boarding house to collect his few belongings. He would take the first train north in the morning, would carry the copied pages back to Philadelphia, would finally have the evidence he needed to prove what had been done. But as he walked through the empty streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Several times he stopped and looked around, but saw nothing, just shadows and silence and the distant sound of the harbor. He was almost back to his boarding house when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw 3 men emerging from an alley. They were rough-looking, the kind of men who did the dirty work that gentlemen didn't want to soil their hands with. "Mr. Vance," one of them said, "we've been looking for you." Vance's hand went to the pistol in his coat pocket, but he knew it was useless. He was outnumbered, and he had never been a fighter. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Wentworth wants to have a word with you," the man said. "About your activities tonight. About your visit to a certain house on Meeting Street." Vance felt his stomach drop. They knew. Somehow they had known he was in Charleston, had been watching him, had seen him break into Drayton's house. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Don't play stupid," the man said. "You're coming with us now." They grabbed him before he could react, strong hands gripping his arms, dragging him back into the alley. He tried to struggle, tried to shout, but a hand clamped over his mouth, and then something hit him hard on the back of the head, and the world went dark. Vance woke to pain and darkness. His head throbbed where he had been struck, and his hands were bound behind his back. He was lying on a hard floor, and the air smelled of mold and stagnant water. He tried to move and found that his ankles were also tied. Gradually, his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He was in some kind of cellar or basement, with stone walls and a low ceiling. A thin line of light showed beneath a door at the top of a short flight of stairs. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious. Hours. A full day. His mouth was dry, and his body ached from lying on the cold stone. Then he heard footsteps above, and the door opened. Light flooded down the stairs, blinding him momentarily. 2 figures descended, Richard Wentworth and another man Vance didn't recognize. "Mr. Vance," Wentworth said, his voice cold and precise, "I warned you what would happen if you returned to Charleston. I told you there would be consequences. But you didn't listen." "Where am I?" Vance asked, his voice hoarse. "Somewhere no one will find you," Wentworth said. "Somewhere we can have a private conversation about what you stole from Mr. Drayton's house." "I didn't steal anything," Vance said. "Don't lie," Wentworth said. "We know you broke into the house. We know you accessed the safe. We know you copied documents. The question is, what did you do with those copies?" Vance said nothing. The papers were in his coat pocket, or at least they had been. He had no idea if his captors had already searched him and found them. Wentworth seemed to read his thoughts. He reached into his own coat and pulled out the folded sheets of paper that Vance had so carefully copied. "Looking for these?" Vance's heart sank. All that risk, all that effort, and now the evidence was in the hands of the very people it incriminated. "These are very interesting," Wentworth continued, unfolding the papers and scanning them. "Very damaging if they were to become public. Proof that Mr. Drayton and others knowingly used toxic materials in the construction of slave quarters. Proof that they calculated the cost of human life against the cost of building materials. This could cause quite a scandal, Mr. Vance. It could even lead to legal action, though I doubt any court in South Carolina would convict a white man based on the testimony of slaves." "Then why do you care?" Vance asked. "If you're so confident that nothing will come of it, because I don't want the hassle," Wentworth said. "I don't want northern newspapers running stories about the horrors of slavery and using these documents as evidence. I don't want abolitionist agitators waving these papers at rallies and demanding justice. It's bad for business, Mr. Vance. It creates instability. And instability is expensive. So what are you going to do?" Vance asked. "Kill me." "That depends on you," Wentworth said. "If you cooperate, If you tell me who else knows about this, who you've shared information with, then perhaps we can come to an arrangement. Perhaps you can leave Charleston alive and return to Philadelphia with a warning to keep your mouth shut. And if I don't cooperate?" Wentworth smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you'll disappear." "People disappear in Charleston all the time, Mr. Vance. The harbor is deep and the currents are strong. No one will ever find your body." Vance felt a cold terror settle over him. He believed Wentworth absolutely. This man had the power and the ruthlessness to make him vanish without a trace. But he also knew that cooperating would be pointless. Even if he told Wentworth everything, about Dr. Finch, about Catherine Hartwell, about the abolitionist networks he had contacted, it wouldn't save him. Wentworth would kill him anyway, to eliminate the risk. "I have nothing to say to you," Vance said. Wentworth's expression hardened. "Very well. I gave you a chance." He turned to the other man. "Make him talk. Use whatever methods you deem necessary. But keep him alive for now. I want to know everyone he's been in contact with." The other man nodded and pulled out a knife. Vance felt his breath catch in his throat. He had never been tortured, had never even been in a serious fight. He had no idea if he would have the strength to resist, to protect the people who had helped him. But before the men could approach, there was a sound from above, a loud crash followed by shouting. Wentworth and his companion froze, looking up at the ceiling. "What the hell?" Wentworth started to say, but then the door at the top of the stairs burst open and men poured down into the cellar. It took Vance a moment to process what was happening. The men were armed, and they were moving with military precision. They grabbed Wentworth and his companion, forcing them to the ground, securing their hands behind their backs. And then Vance saw a familiar face. Jacob Hemlock, followed by two other men, one of whom was carrying a lantern. "Mr. Vance," Hemlock said, kneeling beside him and cutting the ropes that bound his hands and feet. "Are you all right? How did you?" Vance started to say, but Hemlock cut him off. "No time for explanations. We need to get you out of here. Can you walk?" Vance nodded, though his legs were shaky as Hemlock helped him to his feet. They climbed the stairs and emerged into what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse near the docks. The men who had rescued him were a mix of free blacks and white abolitionists, all armed and all looking grim. "We've been watching Wentworth," Hemlock explained as they hurried out of the warehouse and into the night. "We knew he was looking for you. Knew he had men searching the city. When they grabbed you, we followed. We couldn't intervene immediately, there were too many of them, and we needed to wait for reinforcements. But we got here in time." "The papers," Vance said. "Wentworth has the papers." "We got them back," Hemlock said, patting his coat pocket. "Everything you copied is safe." They made their way through the dark streets to the docks, where a small boat was waiting. "This will take you to a ship that's leaving for Philadelphia tonight," Hemlock said. "You'll be safe once you're on board." "What about you?" Vance asked. "What about Wentworth?" "He'll come after you." "Let him try," Hemlock said. "We have friends in this city, Mr. Vance, more than you know. And we're tired of being silent. We're tired of watching people suffer and die while men like Wentworth and Drayton profit from their misery. Your investigation, your courage, it's inspired people. It's shown us that the truth matters, that it's worth fighting for." "But the risk," Vance started to say. "We've been living with risk our whole lives," Hemlock said. "This is just another kind. Now go. Get those papers to Philadelphia. Publish them. Tell the world what you found. Make sure that what happened here is never forgotten." Vance wanted to say more, wanted to thank Hemlock properly, but there was no time. The boat was waiting, and every minute he stayed in Charleston was another minute of danger. He climbed into the boat, and it pushed off from the dock, the oars cutting silently through the dark water. As the city receded behind him, Vance looked back at the lights of Charleston, at the grand houses and church steeples silhouetted against the night sky. Somewhere in that city, people were sleeping in quarters built with poisoned clay, their bodies slowly breaking down, their lives measured in economic calculations. And somewhere in that city, men like Wentworth and Drayton were sleeping peacefully, secure in their wealth and power, confident that they would never face consequences for what they had done. But Vance had the evidence now. He had the proof. And he would make sure the world knew. Vance arrived back in Philadelphia in early September of 1849, exhausted but triumphant. He immediately contacted Dr. Finch and Catherine Hartwell, showing them the copied pages from Drayton's ledger. Their reactions mirrored his own, horror and outrage. "This is it," Catherine said, her eyes blazing as she read the entries. "This is the evidence we needed. This proves that the poisoning was deliberate, that it was part of a calculated business strategy. This changes everything." Over the next several weeks, they worked to get the documents published. It was not easy. Many newspapers were still reluctant to run such inflammatory material, fearing backlash from Southern interests or accusations of abolitionist bias. But finally, in October of 1849, the New York Tribune published a lengthy article detailing Vance's investigation, including excerpts from Drayton's ledger. The response was explosive. The article was reprinted in newspapers across the North, sparking outrage and demands for action. Abolitionist groups seized on it as proof of slavery's inherent evil. Some Northern politicians called for federal investigations into conditions on Southern plantations. There were even a few voices in the South, mostly from religious leaders and reform-minded individuals, who expressed shock and called for changes in how enslaved people were housed and treated. But there was also fierce resistance. Southern newspapers denounced the article as a fabrication, a piece of abolitionist propaganda designed to inflame tensions. They questioned the authenticity of the documents, suggested that Vance had forged them or taken them out of context. Some went further, attacking Vance personally, calling him a thief, a liar, a traitor to his race. Nathaniel Drayton himself issued a statement denying everything. He claimed that the ledger entries were misinterpreted, that he had never knowingly used toxic materials, that the health problems in the quarters were due to the inherent weakness of the Negro Constitution, not to any environmental factors. He threatened to sue Vance and the Tribune for libel. The legal threats came to nothing. Drayton had no interest in actually going to court, where the documents might be examined more closely and where he might be forced to testify under oath. But the controversy raged for months, becoming part of the larger national debate over slavery that was tearing the country apart. Vance continued his speaking tours, now armed with even more powerful evidence. He showed audiences the copied pages from Drayton's ledger, let them read the cold calculations that reduced human life to a matter of profit and loss. The impact was profound. Many people who had been ambivalent about slavery, who had accepted the arguments that it was a necessary evil or a positive good, were forced to confront the reality of what the system actually meant in practice. But Vance took no satisfaction in his growing fame. He was haunted by the knowledge that his investigation had changed nothing for the people still living in the poisoned quarters. The plantations continued to operate. The clay continued to be used. And despite all the outrage and publicity, no one in authority had taken action to stop it. In the spring of 1850, Vance received a letter from Charleston. It was from Jacob Hemlock, and the news was grim. Wentworth and his associates had retaliated against the people who had helped rescue Vance. Several free blacks had been arrested on trumped-up charges. Others had been forced to flee the city. And there were rumors that Hemlock himself was being watched, that he was in danger. "I don't regret what we did," Hemlock wrote. "But I wanted you to know the cost. I wanted you to understand that your investigation, your truth-telling, has consequences for people beyond yourself. We pay the price for your courage, Mr. Vance. We always have. That's the reality of this system." The letter shook Vance deeply. He had known intellectually that his work put others at risk. But seeing it spelled out so starkly, knowing that people were suffering because they had helped him, was almost unbearable. He wrote back immediately, offering to help in any way he could: money, legal assistance, connections to abolitionist networks that might be able to get people to safety. But he never received a response. He didn't know if Hemlock had gotten the letter or if something had happened to him before it arrived. Over the following years, Vance continued his work, but the joy had gone out of it. He spoke at rallies and wrote articles and corresponded with other abolitionists, but he was increasingly consumed by guilt and frustration. The country was sliding toward civil war, the tensions between North and South becoming unbridgeable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that all his efforts had accomplished nothing. In 1852, he received a letter from Dr. Finch with news that brought him some small measure of comfort. A medical journal had finally published a paper on the health effects of heavy metal exposure, citing Vance's work and Finch's chemical analyses. It was a dry, technical piece, focused on the science rather than the politics, but it represented a kind of validation. The truth was entering the scientific record, becoming part of the body of knowledge that future generations would inherit. And then, in 1853, something unexpected happened. A plantation owner in Virginia, a man named Thomas Whitfield, who was known for his relatively progressive views on slavery, read about Vance's investigation and decided to have the quarters on his own plantation tested. He hired a chemist to analyze the materials used in construction, and the chemist found elevated levels of lead in the clay that had been used for chinking. Whitfield was horrified. He immediately ordered the quarters to be rebuilt using clean materials. And he wrote a letter to the Richmond Enquirer describing what he had found and urging other plantation owners to do the same. The letter caused a minor sensation in Virginia, and a few other owners followed Whitfield's example. It was a small victory, affecting only a handful of plantations out of thousands. But it was something. It was proof that the truth could make a difference. That knowledge could lead to change, even in a system as entrenched and brutal as slavery. Vance lived to see the Civil War, though he was too old to fight. He spent the war years working with the United States Sanitary Commission, helping to improve conditions in military hospitals and camps. He thought often of the quarters he had investigated, of the people who had lived and died in those poisoned structures, and he wondered if any of them had lived to see freedom. After the war, during Reconstruction, Vance returned to Charleston one final time. He was 60 years old, his hair completely white, his body weakened by years of hard work and stress. The city was changed, occupied by federal troops, its economy shattered, its social order upended. Many of the grand houses were damaged or abandoned. The plantations that had once made the region wealthy were struggling to adapt to a world without slave labor. Vance visited some of the plantations he had surveyed in 1847. The quarters were still standing, though many were empty now, the people who had lived in them scattered by war and emancipation. He walked through the silent structures, touching the walls that were still packed with gray clay, and he thought about all the lives that had been damaged or destroyed by the greed and callousness of men like Nathaniel Drayton. He tried to find some of the people he had spoken with during his investigation, Jacob Hemlock, others whose stories had shaped his understanding of what had happened. But most were gone, dead or moved away or simply impossible to trace in the chaos of the post-war South. He did find one person, though, a woman named Sarah, who had been a child living in one of the contaminated quarters when Vance first came to Charleston. She was in her 30s now, living in a small house in the city, working as a seamstress. She remembered him. Or rather, she remembered the stories about the northern surveyor who had asked questions about the quarters, who had tried to expose the truth. Did it help? She asked him. All your work, all your investigating, did it change anything? Vance wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her that his work had mattered, that it had saved lives, that it had brought justice. But he couldn't lie to her. I don't know, he said honestly. Some people listened. Some things changed. But not enough. Not nearly enough. Sarah nodded, as if she had expected that answer. My mother died when I was 12, she said. She got sick the way so many people did in those quarters. She wasted away, got weaker and weaker until one day she just didn't wake up. I always wondered why. Why her? Why so many others? And then I heard about your investigation, about the poison in the walls, and I understood. I'm sorry, Vance said. I'm so sorry I couldn't do more. You did what you could, Sarah said. You told the truth. That matters, even if it didn't change everything. Because now we know. Now it's part of the record. And maybe someday, when people look back at this time, they'll understand what was done to us. They'll understand the full cost of slavery. Not just the whips and chains, but the slow poisoning, the deliberate cruelty, the way our lives were calculated in dollars and cents. Vance left Charleston for the last time in the fall of 1865, carrying with him Sarah's words and the weight of all the stories he had collected over the years. He returned to Philadelphia and spent his remaining years writing a comprehensive account of his investigation, documenting everything he had learned about the silent quarters and the gray clay and the men who had knowingly poisoned the people in their power. The manuscript was published in 1871, 2 years before Vance's death. It was not a bestseller. By then, the country was tired of hearing about the horrors of slavery, eager to move on and rebuild. But it found an audience among historians and reformers, people who believed that the past needed to be remembered and understood, not forgotten. And in the decades that followed, as scholars began to seriously study the history of slavery and its effects, Vance's work became an important source. His meticulous documentation, his chemical analyses, his testimonies, all of it contributed to a growing understanding of the full scope of the system's cruelty. The silent quarters themselves gradually disappeared. Some were torn down during Reconstruction. Others simply collapsed from neglect, their poisoned walls crumbling back into the earth. The Whispering Earth, the swamp where the gray clay had been harvested, was eventually drained and filled in, its toxic sediments buried under layers of clean soil. But the story survived. It survived in Vance's writings, in the records he had so carefully preserved, in the memories of the people who had lived through it. And it served as a reminder, a dark, troubling reminder of what human beings are capable of when they value profit over life, when they see other people not as fellow humans but as resources to be exploited and discarded. The mystery of the silent quarters, of the buildings where no rats or snakes would enter, had been solved. The answer was not supernatural, not mysterious in any mystical sense. It was brutally, terribly simple. The quarters were poisoned. Deliberately poisoned by men who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway because it saved them money. That was the truth that Elias Vance had uncovered. That was the truth he had spent years of his life documenting and fighting to expose. And that was the truth that, even now, more than a century and a half later, still has the power to shock and horrify anyone who learns it. Because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality, that the worst horrors are not the work of monsters or demons, but of ordinary people making rational calculations. People who can look at suffering and death and see only numbers on a ledger. People who can sleep peacefully at night, knowing that their comfort and wealth are built on the slow poisoning of other human beings. That is the real horror of the silent quarters. Not that they were haunted, but that they were not. Not that they were the work of some evil supernatural force, but that they were the work of men. Men who kept careful records, who attended church on Sundays, who considered themselves civilized and moral, and who nonetheless chose profit over human life, again and again and again. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? The truth about Charleston's silent quarters is now part of the historical record, preserved in archives and academic studies. But there are still questions that may never be fully answered. How many people died because of the poison clay? How many children grew up with damaged bodies and minds? How many plantation owners knew the truth and chose to ignore it? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If you found this tale as chilling as I did, and if you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker corners of American history. These are the stories they don't teach in schools, the truths that were deliberately buried. But they matter. They matter because they show us what we're capable of, for better and for worse. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another forgotten chapter of America's past.